William Blake was the glorious luminary of British art. He was a painter, printmaker, poet and visionary, a radical fired by a unique genius. Aside from 3 years spent in Sussex, he lived all his life in London, was born here in Soho and never ventured far. It was a time of revolution, war, and the onset of the dark miseries of industrialisation. Yet only in London, Blake said, could he carry on his visionary studies and dream his dreams. He was impoverished, marginalised, misunderstood, and often taken for a madman. But we set this in contrast to the astonishing majesty of his imagination and the prolific production of images as powerful as they are complex, and which are now being celebrated at Tate Britain.
Blake's the most grandly imaginative of British artists, a British artist who aspired to be Michelangelo. He never created a Sistine Chapel, but he created the Sistine Chapel in the form of illuminated manuscripts, illuminated books.
He spends the day doing engravings, he spends the evenings doing watercolours. Poetry, he sort of fits it in, something that he does, wakes up in the middle of the night and writes some poetry.
Samuel Palmer said that Blake was a man without a mask, that there was no side to him, that he looked straight and steady and into the heart of matter.
Blake had visions. I mean, some people say he had this sort of eidetic memory, which means that what you imagine is actually there. When he says to somebody, when you see the sun, you just see a big red disc that looks much like a guinea. I see the heavenly hosts crying out, glory, 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 Hosanna in the highest. He was painting what he saw.
Blake was apprenticed to the engraver James Bessiere, who sent the boy to Westminster Abbey to make sketches of the Gothic tombs in preparation for a volume of engravings. The experience had a profound influence on the young Blake.
We are in the chapel of Edward the Confessor. In the centre is a magnificently grand and elevated tomb. Blake often was seen to be clambering on the top to get a top-down view of these. There's Edward III, Queen Philippa, Henry III, Queen Eleanor, Richard II, Queen Anne. So these were really the kind of glorious monuments to the kings and queens of a past age in Britain.
Amy Concannon is a curator at Tate Britain.
Blake ideologically valued the medieval period as a time when old England, ancient England, was at its best. British culture was at its purest and developing in a way that hadn't yet been corrupted by things like commerce or stylistically by too much embellishment and over-the-top ornamentation.
Blake apparently recalled later in life that in the Abbey he saw the spirits that dwelled in the Gothic vaults, and that there were moments when the aisles filled with a great procession of monks and priests and choristers, and his entranced ear heard the chant of plainsong, while the vaulted room trembled to the sound of organ music.
The Industrial Revolution was dawning. It was creating wealth, but it was also causing complete misery.
This is Rachel Campbell-Johnston, art critic of the Times.
It's hardly surprising that against this backdrop, those at least with the leisure to be able to harbour such fantasies, began to look back to rural idylls, to a lost age, and to find in the Middle Ages of England a spiritual antidote to contemporary materialism and contemporary poverty. And the Gothic style could be seen as something incredibly patriotic. We could cling to it and we could say, here we are, the Brits, glorious and successful in the wake of Waterloo.
Blake was aware of the importance of the moment nationally and had youthful aspirations to become a history painter in the grand style. But needs must, and Blake, newly married to his devoted helpmate Catherine, opened a workshop collaborating with the radical publisher Joseph Johnston. Blake's own works, such as the songs of Innocence and Experience, were wonderful pairings of poem and illustration on the same page.
Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night. What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry?
That sold reasonably well, but often only a few copies of his works were made and sold privately to friends and collectors.
On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? And what shoulder? And what art could twist?
Jonathan Jones is a critic and author of Sensations, a new book tracing the story of British art from Hogarth to Banksy.
Well, we're looking at 2 pages from the Songs of Innocence and Experience. The Tiger from the Songs of Experience, one of Blake's most famous poems, but was originally printed as an illuminated book. And The Lamb, which we're also looking at, they both have a kind of childlike simplicity to them, a folkloric quality and a rustic quality. The Lamb is from the Songs of Innocence in 1789, year of the French Revolution, but it's not a political book, or it doesn't seem to be. It seems to be a very sweet collection of innocent rustic ballads. Then in 1794 he publishes Songs of Experience, which are much darker and more troubling and ironic, and they have an ironic undercutting relationship with the Songs of Innocence.
You know, you and I are looking at them now, and they are just wonderful. But nothing like this had existed before. There were, of course, illustrations, but nothing remotely like this. They weren't as bold, they weren't as dynamic. There wasn't this wonderful design marriage, really. We're looking in The Lamb, the case of a kind of framed, twisted, beautiful arch of hawthorn or something budding into bloom. And everything is really astonishingly perfectly calculated between text and design, and there was nothing like that.
What Blake strove for was a means of reproducing his poetry and his drawings in combination with one another.
Before Blake, the text of books would be printed in a letterpress workshop, while illustrations were engraved separately elsewhere. Michael Phillips is a Blake scholar who has studied Blake's printing method and reproduced the press he used.
In a single stroke, Blake conflated that huge and complex and highly managed production line into his own studio, his composite art, such as is illustrated in the Songs of Innocence and the Songs of Experience. Blake's innovation was incredibly simple. He took his very fine camel hair brush and dipped it into stop-out varnish and used the stop-out varnish on his brush like he would ink. And onto the surface of the copper plate, he wrote his text in mirror writing, and then above and below and interweaving the text written in reverse, he drew his design. When the stop-out varnish had dried and hardened, it becomes an acid resist. Blake then poured almost certainly nitric acid, and brushing it with a feather, the acid would bite down and corrode all of the areas that Blake did not want to ink and print. The text and design stood proud because they were protected. He could write the text, draw the design, and be entirely responsible for the reproduction. Blake was completely above and beyond censorship. He was not subject to any of the political impositions following the Reign of Terror in Paris and the reaction to that in 1792-93 in London. So a work like America, a Prophecy, or Europe, a Prophecy, published at the height of this period, would not have stood a chance if it had to go to the stationer's office and to be passed by the censor.
Blake fiercely opposed the political oppression that was the fallout from the French Revolution. But he also set his face against the materialism and reductive empiricism, as he saw it, of the Enlightenment. The frontispiece to Europe, a Prophecy, an illustration also known as the Ancient of Days, shows Urizen, a naked, bearded but muscular old man, leaning out from the sun with vast compasses, a grim scientist measuring the unmeasurable universe. And those compasses reappear in Blake's most famous visual work, his large colour print of Isaac Newton.
For Blake, Newton is a tyrannical figure, an architect of a clockwork cosmos, which Blake finds repellent. Newton's laws underwrite the age of the steam engine and of commercial calculation, which Blake felt he was living in. The satanic mills derive from Newton's laws. But this portrait of Newton is an extraordinary and beautiful and compelling and a surreal thing. He seems to be under the sea. There are weird alien sea creatures and corals all around him. He's sitting there naked and he's using compasses and he's delineating a triangle. In other words, doing what Blake denounced him for doing, which is mapping and claiming to know the universe rationally. But this has become this bent-over figure of Newton. There's a sculpture of it by Eduardo Palozzi outside the British Library. It's on the cover of popular science books. Yeah, we don't think of it as an anti-science image at all. We think of it as a heroic image.
Yet again, this is a figure straight out of Michelangelo, which could not possibly be more beautiful. I mean, he has his copper auburn curls, this utterly heroic, classical Greco-Roman face seen in profile, the perfect musculature. He's actually given the most perfect expression of heroic beauty to the person he regards as responsible for all the infamy in the world.
He repeats the line, everything that lives is holy.
One thing that is supremely important for Blake is the closeness of God. God is in us. He lives in all of us. And the worst thing you can do is have a remote God, because if the God is remote, then you have to listen to the people who claim to be tuned into God. Priests, for example, the institutional church, and they are all about obedience and repression and hate the human body and hate sex and hate the imagination.
He rejects the whole Christian anti-physical tradition.
He and Catherine are sitting starkers in their garden, and his friend and painter William Butts comes on and said, "No, come along, well, it's just Adam and Eve." And that's so adorable, it has to be true.
Blake also took issue with the prevailing art establishment, and this was partly his dislike of authority in any form. He saw the leading artists as just determined to make a lucrative career painting portraits, even though they talked about great painting. But in his view, they were hypocrites because they weren't doing great painting.
This is the biographer and historian, Jenny Uglow.
Of course, Blake himself had been a student at the Royal Academy School of Design. When he went, he was filled with ambitions to be a great history painter. But the longer he stayed, the more irritated he became. And for Blake, this is really summed up in his deep dislike of Sir Joshua Reynolds, who was then president of the Royal Academy. He describes Reynolds as a man born to depress art. Blake said, "He that has never travelled in his thoughts and minds to heaven is no artist." But there was one teacher whom he did like, in fact admired greatly, and that was the Irish painter James Barry. And he was really still in the middle of his greatest work, 6 huge paintings, the progress of human knowledge and culture for the Society of Arts. Grand, Michelangelo-esque, but heroic stunts, taking you through history, and full of a kind of energy that Blake really admired.
We're here in the RSA, and I'd like to take you into the great room where there are a series of mural paintings by James Barry. We have Orpheus with his lyre, through to the Greeks.
But the British have never been very good at this sort of triumphalism in paint, and Barry's series is generally acknowledged to be a bombastic, lamentable mishmash.
I mean, Barry was opinionated and his behaviour was erratic. He made many enemies at the Royal Academy, and he was basically kicked out, as Blake said, driven out to make room for a pack of sycophants.
In 1809, Blake decided to mount a solo exhibition above his brother's hosiery shop in Broad Street, what's now Broadwick Street in Soho. It was modest in scale, just 16 works, but was intended to promote Blake as an artist worthy of grand public schemes and patronage, rather than, as he was usually known, as an engraver of eccentric tendencies. Along with the exhibition, for 2 and 6pence, visitors could buy Blake's descriptive catalogue. That exhibition, which is recreated for visitors in the show at Tate Britain, begins with a strange pair of pictures. The spiritual form of Nelson guiding Leviathan, and the spiritual form of Pitt guiding Behemoth. Not traditional portraits of the Admiral and the Prime Minister, so much as representations of the essence of these men, caught up in epic battles.
These are pictures which are difficult in a number of ways because of the way they look now and because of the iconography and because they seem to be nationalist and patriotic in a way which doesn't make sense given what our conception of who Blake was.
This is Martin Myrone, senior curator at Tate Britain.
You have Nelson, this great national hero. He's got a pretty perfunctory loincloth on, and then he's got a halo.
And he's very blonde.
Yeah, he's very blonde, tight curled hair. So this is absolutely, this is the way that in the idealising language of 18th century art, you pronounce your national figure as a hero beyond history. Pitt and Nelson, they're mobilising Leviathan, Behemoth, the great biblical monsters that bring death and destruction and transform the world. But that catastrophe could bring a better world.
Yeah.
Blake is pronouncing these as national heroes and national figures, but he's also kind of like saying, well, bring it on. Bring on the apocalypse. That war and terror could actually create a new world where there might be new freedoms and new possibilities, even for, this important figure at the bottom of Nelson's feet, this slave in shackles, a black slave in shackles.
Yeah. We're looking at quite small paintings that were meant for Blake to be like cartoons, maybe 100 feet high. And within these sketches, I suppose, they're fully finished paintings. They're done in tempera because Blake thought oils were corrupt, really, and wanted to sort of connect with an earlier meal painting. But it's almost so, particularly in the Nelson picture, there's too much going on inside his head for the composition to deal with, really, that it feels like, it occasionally feels like a bad evening on the Northern Line, really.
Blake is saying, well, these are just modello, these are just sketches.
Yeah.
Imagine these are 100 feet high. That's what I really want to do. So within our exhibition at Tate Britain, we've got mock-ups showing you what those images would have looked like in a big architectural setting, a cathedral or a palace. And we've got a projection, which is going to allow you to see these paintings blown up. And the surprising thing is, they really work.
But we need to rescue, really, this alternative kind of picturing, which is highly rhetorical, cosmological, on the edge of trippy madness, visionary, which is just as powerful in British art.
Really. Absolutely right. It's visionary and it's wildly imaginative and it's esoteric often.
Yeah.
But it's worth looking at the way Blake talks about the public, even in the descriptive catalogue, when he's got this one-man show, which is a complete commercial failure and critical failure, but he's reaching out to the public. And there's a moment here about reinvigorating the language of history paintings. What he wanted to be was an artist like Michelangelo, Raphael, who was painting in churches and painting in public spaces and talking to a contemporary British public. Sadly, the contemporary British public didn't really hear what he was saying.
There was a single review of Blake's 1809 exhibition, and that was Robert Hunt, writing in the Examiner, cruelly concluded that he'd been in the presence of an unfortunate lunatic.
Worse than that, Hunt said that Blake's wretched pictures were blotted and blurred and badly drawn, and that the catalogue was a farrago of nonsense, the wild effusions of a distempered brain.
Throughout his life, Blake never faltered in his ambition to be acknowledged as a painter of the first order. But the fact of the matter is, from the time he left the Academy until his death, Blake earned his living as a copy engraver of other artists' works. He never sustained himself from the sale of his own work, and it was only a very small coterie of close friends, fellow artists, cognoscenti, who recognized in Blake something extraordinary, but the public really never had a chance.
After the exhibition, Blake retreated from the world. He had already rejected the encouragement of his friend William Haley to make work that was more commercially pleasing. Instead, Blake, asserting his artistic freedom, eked out a living from engraving and continued working on his own projects: Milton, and the epic Jerusalem. A dense creation of poetry and 99 plates that span human history from the fall to redemption. In it, Blake laments the sleep of Albion, the personification of England. It is only the artist, he maintains, who can lead the way out of the world's darkness. The single, completed colour copy of Jerusalem remained unsold at Blake's death. But there was a bright final chapter to Blake's life. The painter John Linnell befriended and revered Blake. His charming pencil sketch of the old artist has survived.
We see him out on Hampstead Heath, where he was often walking with John Linnell, who lived by the heath. He's looking directly out at us, his head turned towards us, his hands clasped on his belly, and you imagine he's about to smile.
Hands, by the way.
He does have big hands and big eyes as well. That was also something that was commented on.
They are the eyes of a prophet, visionary, wide and alert. You certainly have no sense in this sketch of someone with failing powers.
He's feeling at ease, which is nice to see because this comes after a very difficult period in his life when he was very disappointed professionally. He was despairing, he declared himself hid. But his friendship with Linnell was a catalyst to a new period of exciting new things.
Linnell offered him friendship, but far more practically, Linnell was this down-to-earth businessman, and he was determined to advance Blake's career, to get this otherworldly man onto the artistic map. You know, this man who we see now as the great architect of eternity, he was about to take on a commission drawing poultry and pigs. Linnell gave him a job, first of all, engraving his own watercolour designs for the Book of Job. And then later, when Blake must have been around his mid-70s, he commissioned him to illustrate Dante's Divine Comedy. And he paid Blake on weekly account. And this allowance would have probably been all that stood between the Blakes and destitution, really.
The Divine Comedy was a gargantuan job, occupying the last 3 years of Blake's life. He made 103 watercolours and a handful of engravings, and still it wasn't finished. But he was at the top of his game for draftsmanship and the use of colour. This image from the Inferno shows a wicked pope plunged into a fiery well.
We're in the 8th circle of hell.
It could be worse.
It could be worse. But imagine, looking at
Not
this
much.
in bed. But we're looking at the terrible fate suffered by the Simoniac Pope. This is, as Dante's text describes, Nicholas III, punished for buying or selling ecclesiastical promotions. So you can imagine Blake as someone who railed against abuse of power and corruption, maybe quite enjoying imagining this description of a pope being plunged headfirst into this stony fire pit. And above you've got Dante and Virgil clinging to one another out of fear.
When he's this good, he is a phenomenal draftsman. He's a phenomenal draftsman, don't you think?
And a colourist too, I think.
And
what's
colourist,
remarkable about this, the colour across the sheet is magnificent. It's hot, cold. Hell, as Dante describes it, was a world of ice and fire.
Yeah.
So you get that sense of these two conflicting but painful elements in the hot, bright red, orange, and then the deep blue and icy blue too.
But it's perfectly done so that you have this kind of almost stage set rocky background with the three figures sort of dominating it, and everything works.
He was freed at that moment from having to do his day job, if you like, and they set free his really improvisatory fluency as a draftsman.
Rachel Campbell-Johnston has written a biography of Samuel Palmer, the romantic landscape artist who was introduced to Blake by Linnell.
Palmer gave some really very lovely descriptions of his first meeting with the old visionary Blake, who was by then living in this rather morose-looking red building on the Strand, and he seldom ventured out for anything much more than a pot of porter. And the young artist remembered crossing a reception room. Its walls were absolutely plastered with pictures, to reach a second chamber, which was a workshop, a bedroom, a kitchen, a study, all crammed together. And Blake, who had actually just scalded his foot, couldn't walk. He was sitting in a bed by a window from which he could just glimpse the Thames like a bar of gold, he described it. He sat propped up on his pillows, and Palmer described him as looking like one of the antique patriarchs or a dying Michelangelo. He was absolutely in awe. Blake's eye, he said, was the finest he ever saw. It could flash with genius or melt with tenderness, and it could be terrible too.
Palmer was one of a group of idealistic young artists, companions who called themselves the Ancients.
As far as they were concerned, heaven beat in the blood of this shabby, sad old engraver who they met. They saw a prophet crying out in the wilderness. And Fountain Court, where Blake was living at the time that they met him, became a place of pilgrimage. They would gaze up at the divine window, as they call it, where the blessed man did his work. I don't think it was that incredibly abstruse and, let's face it, downright incomprehensible mythology that he built up that they were buying into, if you like. I think it was his idea of the Gothic. I mean, Blake was obsessed with the idea of a lost spiritual age. When Blake died, Samuel Palmer had shortly before moved to Shoreham, which was to become the rural outpost of the Ancients. And it was one of the Ancients who brought him the news of Blake's death. Just before he died, his countenance became fair, his eyes brightened, and he burst out in singing of the things he saw in heaven.
Though it was Alexander Gilchrist who rescued Blake from obscurity when his biography was published in 1863, Linnell and Palmer would help to carry the Blake legend into the Victorian age. As a man whose authenticity, self-sacrifice, and creative independence crystallized into the idea we have of Blake, the quintessential romantic visionary. Blake was buried at Bunhill Fields, the Dissenter Cemetery in the City of London. Last year, after his exact resting place was discovered, a new stone was laid. The epitaph, set to music, is a fitting tribute to the liberating power of the imagination. I give you the end of a golden string. Only wind it into a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate, built in Jerusalem's wall.